obscure world of parking. We use it every day, but have we really capitalized on the intricacies of our industry? In this podcast, the Parking Network will go behind the scenes and talk to industry professionals about all things parking, from the horizon of evolving technology and even stories of the old days. We hope to encourage and inspire operators and property managers alike to look at parking through a new lens.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Our Parking Industry Podcast. My name is Leigh Thomas, and I am with my colleague Trina Tutor in the studio, and we have a guest with us today. We have Nick Nicholas here, and we're so excited about a very interesting conversation about parking and so many things that can go with it. So, hey guys, welcome to the studio.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. Nick, why don't you take a minute, tell us about yourself, tell us how you got into parking. That's always an interesting story. Thanks for your time. We're glad you're here.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. So, hi everybody. My name is Nick Nicholas. You cannot mess it up. It's Nicholas. You'll never forget it. Buy me a beer at the next industry conference, and I'll tell you the story about that if you want.
Yes, I will do that. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, of course. So I work as a police captain for a small municipal agency in Orange County, California. And in my real life job, I'm a police officer, and I've been a police officer for 16 years. But somehow I found myself really deeply entrenched in the parking industry. So I'll tell you how that happened. 3 years ago, I got promoted to the rank of captain, which is second in command of the department. And the chief called me into his office and he goes to shake my hand. He said, "Congratulations, Nick, I'm making you a captain. And now you're going to be in charge of all the stuff that they don't make cop shows about," right? It's none of this sexy stuff. It's hiring and recruiting and internal affairs and records and dispatch and training and animal control and parking. And I think maybe in my career, I'd written a dozen parking tickets, but suddenly I find myself now responsible for all of parking. And what's interesting about my city is that all of parking management lives in the police department. So it's not just enforcement, it's citation processing, permitting, vendor agreements, everything fell on my desk. So very, very quickly, I had to become the parking guy. And it's funny because I work in a very, very safe community where there's very little crime. So we have an opportunity to focus on quality of life issues, and parking is most certainly one of those quality of life issues. And people feel as both of you ladies know, people feel very, very strongly about parking. I will say I'm not passionate about parking. I'm really not. I didn't go through the police academy to manage a parking program. But I really come to respect and admire the parking industry and how much parking touches everything. And I will say that parking people are a lot of fun.
Why, thank you very much. You can just say that multiple times in this episode and that will just get us a lot of listeners.
Yeah, sure.
Well, thank you for being here on your own time today.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so good disclaimer. I'm not here on behalf of any city or government agency. I'm doing this on my own time because I have something that, although I'm not passionate about parking, I am passionate about frontline safety. And I'd love to share this message with anybody who's able to hear it, because we have a lot of work to do in order to keep our frontline parking professionals safe.
Okay, well, let's just hear about that right now. If our listeners hear anything today, what is the message that you want them to come away with loud and clear?
Sure. Well, thanks for asking. And, I have a lot of strong opinions about this. So let me give you a little bit of the backstory. So a couple years ago, I set up a Google alert. And I don't know if either of you set up Google alerts to get headlines, but I set up a Google alert for parking enforcement because I was curious to see what other agencies are doing. And there's a few initiatives that I want to put forward in my own city. So I thought, I'd get the headlines. This city is implementing a new paid parking program, or this vendor has signed a contract with this agency or something like that. But what was really shocking and alarming to me is nearly every week I get headlines that say some frontline parking enforcement officer is getting berated, yelled at, assaulted, guns pulled on them, beat up, shot, or even worse. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that all these headlines that I was seeing on a consistent basis. So I end up going to a bunch of different parking conferences and talking to operators and frontline staff and parking managers and saying, what are we as a parking industry doing to help keep our frontline personnel safe, especially in light of all these headlines that I'm getting? And, unfortunately, I got a kind of a resounding, it's on the job training, or we do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But that's shocking to me. And I found myself in a very weird position where I can speak both policing and parking. And I think if we implement just some very basic officer safety techniques around situational awareness and de-escalation and customer service and wellness and resiliency, we can go a really long way in preventing a lot of these encounters that result in violence being committed against our frontline personnel.
Is that something you'd be willing to share a little bit about right now? Like, what are some of those police tactics or training things that people who are writing citations need to know about?
Yeah, sure. I want to be clear. I'm not advocating that frontline parking professionals become police officers or go through a police academy or do any of that training. But I think we as an industry have a long way to go. And there's a lot of little things that we can do to help keep our frontline personnel safe. First is situational awareness. And when we talk about situational awareness, it's more than just being aware of your surroundings. What does situational awareness actually look like? And I know we've all seen those videos or even seen it in person where somebody is so focused on their cell phone in front of them that they walk into a pole or walk into a glass wall or something like that. And it's really funny. But for somebody who's working out in the field or has contact with the public, especially in interactions that are often high stress or confrontational, you really have to be way more aware of your environment than just walking around kind of blissfully ignorant to everything that's going on. So that's the first step, is just pay attention to what's going on around you. And there's a few techniques that I really advocate for. So when I was going through training to become a police officer, my field training officer said, when you write a ticket, and this was back in the paper ticket days, right? You
Sure.
fill out one line of the ticket and then look up, look around, see what's going on around you, and then go back and do the next line and keep doing that over and over again. Well, the same can be very easily translated on a citation handheld, right? Fill out 2 or 3 boxes. At that point, your attention is just a few inches away from your face, and then look up, look around, see what's going on around you, see what's going on behind you, and then go back and do that. And it's one of those skills that after a while, it will just become second nature to you if you practice that. And that way you won't know if somebody is, upset because you're standing in front of their car and they think they're getting a ticket or their car is getting towed. It buys you a little bit more time to react. And it's very simple. It doesn't cost anything. It's easy to implement. It's easy to teach. It's easy to learn. But unfortunately, I don't hear anyone in the parking industry talking about these things or saying these little techniques like this that will help keep people safe.
Would you also, I'm wondering about when we are entering into a street that we need to be walking, or we're entering into an enclosed parking facility. What are some wise behaviors for when I'm entering and want to quickly digest my observations so that I am aware? Do you have any tips about that moment?
Yeah, Leigh, that's such a great question. So remember when you get on the airplane and the flight attendant says, take a moment to look around you and identify the nearest exit, keeping in mind that it might be behind you?
Right.
Well, they do that intentionally because they want you to make a mental note of where that exit is before the plane crashes, right? Because those few seconds might be the difference between, life or death in a plane crash. Well, same thing goes for situational awareness, especially if you're entering into a confined area or an office or a parking structure, as you should always know where your avenues of escape are. Because if things do suddenly become confrontational or hostile, you want to know how you can get away to a safe place. And it's really easy to do. It just takes a second. And again, after a while, it just becomes second nature. Now, I want to make one thing very clear. I don't want people to walk around in fear. I don't want them to be paranoid. I don't want them to suffer from hypervigilance, which, so many of my colleagues suffer for. But just the bare minimum situational awareness, knowing where your exits are, kind of keeping your head on a swivel will go a long way to keeping people safe.
Well, thank you for these tips and tricks and just for caring about everyone who's on the front line, because they matter and we can all do a little better to share best practices and help keep each other safe.
Yeah, I agree.
I can tell that you are a very good teacher. And I looked at your LinkedIn in preparation for this conversation.
Thank you.
And I noticed that you're not only a police captain and not only a parking advocate, but you are also a teacher. What do you love about that space? What have you learned about teaching and about learning that's helpful in your day to day?
Yeah, I love learning and I will be a lifelong learner. Truthfully, I think it's just because I get bored more than anything else. And when I finished my undergrad, I said I'm never going back to school, and then I finished my master's, and I'm never going back to school, and here I am, kind of perpetually in school. But I love academia, and I love research, and I love finding out answers to questions that we don't know. And so much police training is from cops that think they're big bad policemen, and they wear their sleeves really tight, and they stand up in front of the room and they tell you why to do it, and then they'll tell you a bunch of war stories. And when you ask why do we do it this way, they say, well, because I said so, and look at me, I'm a big bad policeman. That never resonated with me at all. So I try to incorporate as much academic research into my teaching, because if I'm going to say something, I want to back it up with the science. And really, kind of reflecting back on my own journey to where I am now, there were so many wonderful teachers and so many incredible professors that really inspired me, and many of whom I still keep in contact with to this day. And I want to be that for the next generation of professionals, whether they go into policing or they go into parking or mobility or whatever they're interested in. I want to help inspire them to do that. I think there's already so many barriers to entry for higher education, especially for first generation or undocumented college students, that I want to make it as approachable as possible so that they continue their academic journey.
Perfect. Okay, well, let's circle back. The reason you're here is because you're in this really cool space between government policy and law enforcement, and then parking. I kind of want to settle in the parking lane for just a minute. Yeah. Parking is something that every resident of your county deals with, but very few people understand how really complex parking is. What does managing parking enforcement actually look like on a normal day?
Sure, you're absolutely right. And I'm curious to hear from both of you about this too. But, even my dear mother, when I tell her that I'm going to all these parking conferences or speaking about parking, or even that I'm going to be on a parking podcast, she cannot fathom, right, why this is such a big industry and why there's so much to talk about in parking. And truthfully, I didn't realize it either until I got into it. I'm sure you both have the same experience, right?
Yep, we do. Absolutely.
Yeah. So managing parking is a challenge, because you're absolutely right. It touches everything, and everybody who parks a car thinks they're an expert in parking, right? But there's so much science that goes into it, and there's so many aspects of managing a parking program successfully. And I think we do a pretty good job of it. There's certainly a lot of room for us to improve. But my philosophy when it comes to parking is that parking should be largely forgettable, right? When somebody comes into my city, I don't want them to think about parking, because the first and maybe only touch that they have with government is parking, where they're going to park. And if we can make that as easy as possible, where they don't even think about it, that's great. I also really believe in an education first approach to parking. And I tell my team, I really don't care how many citations they write or cars they towed. My focus is on compliance more than anything. And truthfully, I hate the term parking enforcement officer, because much like the term law enforcement, it feels inherently punitive, right? As if the only reason that we or they exist is to write people tickets or tow cars. But I've often argued that our frontline parking staff have more contact with members of the public than anyone else. Certainly more than the cops. We're lazy. We don't want to get out of our cars. More than Public Works, more than anyone at City Hall. They are out in our busy downtown areas being ambassadors for us. They're answering questions and they're giving restaurant recommendations and they're walking people through how to buy a permit. And that's their interaction with government. So we work in such a tourist town that when people come into our city, the only interaction that they're going to have with anybody from the city is our frontline staff. So I think it's best to kind of go into parking management saying that we want to seek compliance before we take any enforcement action. And I think that's also what the community expects and deserves as well.
And your frontline people deserve that. Like, not only do they have a really important job, but they should be treated well because they are the face of the city to the tourists.
Right, exactly right. It's a, I tell them it's a heavy burden. It's kind of a heavy responsibility for them. They wear our patches just like the police officers, yet they have so much more contact with the public that it's really important for them to make a good first impression. And it's especially challenging when, unfortunately, people think so little of our frontline staff, right? They call them meter maids, or they just think they're there to pad the city's budget, right? Or to ruin people's days. They don't understand really the public safety component of parking compliance and enforcement.
Actually, I had a really fascinating conversation with a woman at a parking forum that I went to a couple of months ago. She works for a municipality in California, and she is the director of the city's meter program. And in an effort to innovate and be progressive in that city, they got rid of a bunch of their meters and put in QR codes and mobile apps to pay for parking. And actually, the community ended up having so many more problems because they weren't getting addressed with the frontline people who were there dealing with the meters. The city didn't realize how often those wonderful meter people de-escalated problems in real time. And so because of the transformation, the city now really values their meters and they're reconsidering getting rid of the rest of them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I, unfortunately, especially in government, I don't think you realize these things until, you've ripped the Band-Aid off and it's already happened. We had a similar experience several years ago where we transitioned from hang tag residential parking permits to virtual plate-based permits for everyone. And it was really a challenge for a lot of residents who every year on October 1st would line up around City Hall to go buy their permit. And, we kind of talked about this and we said, do we roll it out in a phased incremental approach to make it a little bit easier for the community to digest? Or do we just decide really to rip the Band-Aid off and, kind of deal with the fallout? And we did the latter. We ripped the Band-Aid off. We knew there was going to be a lot of fallout and we knew there was going to be a lot of confusion from residents. But one of the things that we did that I thought was really successful is we basically gave the community white glove service, and we had pop-up events to help people log into their computers and get their permits. And we set up a voicemail line that anybody could call into and ask for help. We set up a parking distribution email address where anybody in the community could just email parking at the city. And within 24 hours, they'd get a response from one of our parking professionals on how to get the help. And, it was a struggle for about 6 months. But after that, the community now loves the program because they can switch out permits very easily. They don't have to line up around City Hall. And it's great. So I definitely appreciate your point about the frontline staff being, the ones to kind of help troubleshoot those things. But I think there's ways that you can implement that help, that service, even virtually, not just in person.
In that vein, what other parking technology changes have y'all made besides switching from permits that have impacted your customers and kind of changed the workflow for your employees?
Yeah, so we were the first West Coast city to be fully integrated end-to-end LPR. So everything is plate-based. That's, buying a beach permit to residential parking permit to citations. Everything is done via license plate. And I don't really think the community understands how cool that is. But to me, I look at it as a huge officer safety benefit for our frontline staff. In the past, they'd have to do chalking, they'd have to chalk tires, right? Just like they did in the old days. Now we do digital chalking where all they have to do is drive up and down the street, and the LPR system knows how long the car has been there and if it's moved or not. They can also do ticket stacking, which I think is really important, where a lot of these violations will get sent to their handheld, and then they can park their car around the block, walk back up the street, verify that the vehicle is still illegally parked, and then just hit print and put the ticket on the windshield. The less time that a frontline parking enforcement officer spends at the vehicle, I think, is incredibly beneficial in terms of safety. In California, unfortunately, we're still required to put tickets on windshields. And I know a lot of states don't have that. They have the ability to mail citations as well. I would love to see California go to that for no other reason than I think a lot of these confrontations that our frontline staff get into is because they're interacting with owners of vehicles near their cars.
Sure. So the workflow part of that question is interesting to us because a lot of technology vendors are saying that the technology will replace the humans, that you'll save money, on your payroll if you'll implement this technology. But that's not actually what we're seeing play out in real time. We're seeing that whenever a municipality or a hospital or an airport employs new technology, the technology does what technology does, and it allows the humans to do what humans do, but the technology doesn't actually replace the humans. Has that been your experience, or did you actually have less people on your payroll because of the technology?
No, you're absolutely right. We definitely did not have a reduction in our workforce at all. In fact, we've hired more because it does make them more effective and efficient, and it makes parking compliance so much easier when they don't have to go through those kind of mechanical steps of doing things the old-fashioned way, right? So I see technology as an absolute benefit to everything. Now, there are some growing pains, of course, and it's taken us a while to kind of work through some of the hiccups, especially when you're in a city as innovative as we are, where we're pushing, I think, trying really hard to kind of push the envelope and to bring in new technologies. But I'm excited about what the future of parking looks like.
Good. I'm glad to hear you say that because we are too. So what about in your broad view of your city? What situations have you encountered where improving parking actually solved a larger community? You've already mentioned safety issues, but just how can doing parking well solve community problems?
So that's such a good question. And really everything kind of comes back to parking. And again, I am not passionate about parking, but I am passionate about good governance. And I think parking is a huge part of this, right? And I'll give you an example. So we have parking on our main street, which is our central business district. It's downtown. It's quaint, shops, restaurants, bars. And what we'll see, especially during the summertime, is people will park on Main Street and they'll take their boogie boards and their umbrellas and their coolers and they'll walk down to the beach and they'll be there all day. And maybe they move their car every so often. But in reality, they're not spending $1 in any of our stores, which of course is very detrimental to the business community, but also the overall health of our city. So what we're working on now is making some management changes to manage Main Street a lot better. And what we want to do is push people who want to go to the beach down into the beach lots and then keep Main Street open for people who are actually going to go and visit those stores and get a beer and dine at the restaurant, because that's how our businesses make money. And, you see this. This isn't unique to our city. I was in Colorado Springs recently, and a gorgeous town there, but a lot of the businesses are closed and shuttered. And I think, when you look at economic development and vitality of a city, it almost always comes back, at least in some part, to parking and how easy it is to park and whether or not people will want to park in their downtown areas.
Yes, we agree to all of those things. Parking is so important. And the TPN team is a little bit weary of parking getting a bad rap because it really does ensure the health and vitality of an entire community. It just gets overlooked. So we're kind of trying to change that this podcast.
Can I ask a question of you? So I'm curious, are you seeing conversations around wellness and resiliency in the parking industry? Are we doing enough of that?
I have to say our founder, Clyde Wilson, has been teaching for 45 years now that if you are in parking, you are doing a very difficult job. And also you're doing a job that is very important. So I would say that Clyde has he's been kind of a solo voice, I think, for a long time, saying those words. And that's why Trina and I are here. That's why TBN Consulting is here, because we do want to see an increase in the vitality in this industry. Because someone said, maybe at one of the conventions I went to recently, that parking provides the human experience in America. And so maybe the answer to your question, Nick, is I don't see a lot of vitality yet. But Clyde has a megaphone and he's been preaching it for a long time. And that's why we're here, because we want to see an increase.
Yeah, I'm grateful to hear you say that. And I think these conversations really need to continue. Parking is a thankless job, right? And, I'm lucky that I work in a community that really adores their police department, and I can't, walk down the street or get a cup of coffee without somebody coming up and shaking my hand and thanking me for what I do, almost to the point where it makes me feel uncomfortable. And I love that. I love, being appreciated for what we do. But you never hear that with parking. And I don't care what side of the industry you're on, whether you're an operator, a vendor, a consultant, a frontline staff, nobody's ever thanking you for parking, despite the fact that in America, we're so reliant on our vehicles and automobiles. And I think over time, that has a really detrimental effect on people's mental health. And, certainly in policing, we don't have enough conversations about this. So I think it's absolutely true for the parking industry. I found a really interesting study about a year ago, and it looked at a police department in Minnesota after the murder of George Floyd and during COVID. Can you think of a more stressful time or place to work for a police department in Minnesota after the murder of George Floyd and during COVID? I can't. Maybe like the 92 LA riots, perhaps, but I really can't. And what the researchers did is they looked at the level of on-the-job stress and PTSD symptoms between sworn gun-carrying police officers like me and what they call non-sworn or professional staff, largely frontline staff, right? Who are involved in a lot of these same roles. They just don't have a gun and a taser and all the tools that the police officers have. And what the researchers found was really incredible. They said that there's no significant difference between the level of on-the-job stress and PTSD symptoms between gun-carrying police officers and professional staff, which I've always kind of known, but it was really nice to find this, validated, peer-reviewed academic literature to back it up. And that tells me if there's such a stigma around mental health with policing, and unfortunately, we see police officers take their own life at an alarming rate, the same can probably be said for our parking staff, especially those that have, really negative interactions with the public sometimes, which is why I really want us as a parking industry to have more conversations about wellness and resiliency. And here's my call to action for managers, if you're listening, is take the time frequently to tell your staff how important their jobs are. You do more than just sell LPRs or consult or operate a valet. Your jobs are so incredibly important that the frontline staff really need to hear that from people in high up positions in their organizations, because they're certainly not hearing it from them.
No, and they probably won't hear it from the public because, like you said earlier, parking should be forgettable. We take it for granted. And so I can't be mindful and thankful of something that I'm not even aware of. And when parking is done well, we are not aware of it. So we agree with you here at TPN. So to our listeners out there, if you are in parking, please know that we're here and you are not alone. You can actually find us and give us a call. So speaking of that resiliency and mental health and vitality, what are some best practices or lessons that you have learned that you would recommend to your frontline staff or the law enforcement agencies or municipalities who are listening today? Could you give us maybe some Nick Nicholas pro tips?
Sure. Well, the first step absolutely comes down to empowering our frontline staff. And this is a challenge sometimes, but I don't think it's impossible. And it starts with having conversations like we're having now, where we talk about how important their roles are, not just for our own organization, but for the quality of life issues, in cities or in hospitals or anything like that. It's so important for them to feel empowered and proud of the work that they do. So that's the first step. The next step is to be kind of in tune with your body. And one of the things that I talk about often in any of the trainings or presentations that I give is that we can reduce the number of violent encounters through de-escalation, but we have to be taught how to de-escalate people. And the first step to that is you have to de-escalate yourself before you can de-escalate anyone else. And if we've all done this before, we've all experienced this, but we get into some sort of verbal argument or confrontation with another person. They're upset and then you're upset. And before you know it, you've got steam coming out of your ears, right? Well, that's just a recipe for an explosion, really. So especially if you're a professional, if you're on duty or, working in your capacity, the first thing you have to do is realize that you're getting amped up and then figure out a way to de-escalate yourself so that you can effectively de-escalate the other person. One of the things that they teach SWAT operators to do, especially in traumatic situations, is use a tactic called box breathing or tactical breathing. And you've all probably heard of this, where you breathe in for 4 seconds and then hold it for 4 seconds, exhale for 4 seconds, and then empty lungs for 4 seconds. And if you do that 4 rounds, there's good science that shows it will lower your stress hormones and bring your heart rate down and kind of reduce the stress that's in you. And when I first heard about it, I go, this is some woo-woo LA hippie nonsense, right? And then I read the articles and sure enough, it's actually true. There's good science behind it. And I've used it myself. Sometimes I've gotten upset with one of my colleagues or somebody in the field, and I just take a step back and do a couple rounds of that box breathing, and then I'm able to bring the situation back under control so that I can approach it with a more professional and positive outlook. So there's a lot of little things like that you can do. And really, it's about being professional, being the bigger person and learning what to say and what not to say. I think there's a really important point in any confrontation where it doesn't matter how good you are at de-escalation or verbal judo. There's some people that you're just never going to be able to de-escalate for whatever reason. And in that case, the best thing to do is just leave or run away. There's no issue in parking that is worth getting assaulted over, right? There's no parking violation. I don't care how egregious. I don't care if you're parked in front of an ambulance bay or a fire hydrant or an ADA space or your expired registration, whatever. There's no violation that is worth your own personal safety. So if you don't get them this time, you'll get them next time. And, you're allowed to walk away from things. You don't have to stay in environments where you're going to get upset or, the other person's going to potentially assault you.
That sounds really good in my ears. So I'm going to circle back to one more question. This just parking in general is so sensitive. It's personal. Like you're dealing with, you're not dealing with someone's money or children, but you're dealing with someone's vehicle, which is it is a highly personal situation. How do you deal with this, but also maintain relationships? And then how do you train other people to do that, to do their job, but also value themselves and the human that they're talking to more than the enforcement?
It's really hard. That is a nearly impossible task to do this repeatedly. And you're absolutely right. People are so passionate about their vehicles. And I cannot tell you how many emails or voicemails we get on a daily basis where somebody is upset because they have to pay $2 to park. Right. And even from business owners, we hear this too. Oh my God, if you increase, the rates to pay to park, nobody's going to come into my business. And, my response, which I don't always say to them, which is, if they can't afford to pay $3 to park, do you really want them in your store? What are they going to buy at that point? Right. So it's hard to separate, kind of people's emotional response to parking than anything else. I've seen it sounds kind of weird to say this out loud, but I've seen people who have been the victim of really terrible crimes who kind of cope with things a lot better than they do if they get a ticket or their car gets towed. So I think you're right. There is something like inherently and deeply personal about a person's vehicle. How do you manage that? Well, the first thing you do is just talk about it, right? Kind of put it in perspective. And one of the exercises that I do in my trainings is I ask, like, how many of you have ever gotten a ticket? And all the hands kind of go up. And how many of you have ever gotten your car towed? And maybe half the hands go up. And I think that's your starting point, right? Start with empathy. It's so important to put yourself in the other person's shoes and realize that this might be the biggest issue for them of this day. And, maybe a, $20 parking ticket is the difference between whether or not they're going to be able to feed their children that night. So it's really hugely important to put yourself in the other person's shoes to do that. The next thing is, when you're in these situations, instead of focusing on the problem, try to focus on the next step. So often people are going to repeat phrases, I can't believe you gave me a ticket, or why did you tow my car, or, there's no sign or anything like that. But at that point, the citation is already written, the enforcement action has already been done. There's really nothing that you can do at that point. So what I advocate for people to do is, instead of focusing on the problem, let's shift the conversation to focus on the solution. Here's the next step on how you can contest the ticket, right? Here are the steps that you need to do. Go on the website, fill out the form, and then this is the process for adjudication. And then you set realistic timelines for how long that's going to take. Or if your car gets towed, here are the steps that you need to do to go get a vehicle release and get your car out. And when you can take that conversation away from the problem and toward the solution, goes a long way in de-escalating people and putting that into perspective for them, so that they're hopefully no longer as upset about what happened. And now they're moving towards something actionable that they can take. When people get that upset to the point where they're willing to, commit violence against somebody who's in these roles, it's really not personal. They're not upset at the individual. They're upset at the uniform, right? Or their position. And really, more than that, I think they're disappointed in themselves, because they either knew the rules and chose to avoid them, or they made some sort of mistake or took a gamble or something like that. And they're disappointed in themselves, and they're just taking that out on our frontline staff.
So Nick, we all know that parking is not a static experience. It really has to be fluid and flexible. So what are some best ways for a management team to adapt their parking operations and maybe expectations for busy days or holidays or tourist season? What has your team found that works really well?
Yeah, we have a lot of experience in this. So in our city, our population doubles in the summertime. We're the first beach city off of 3 major freeways. So as soon as it warms up, everybody inland hops on the road and kind of ends up in our city. So we see those seasonal spikes all the time. And it's seasonal, and it's also days of the week spikes a lot. We also have a lot of special events in town where people come in and, they're really impacting our downtown area really heavily. It's a challenge, especially because our parking enforcement staff, they don't just do parking. They're really kind of a Swiss Army knife, and they do animal control and take cold police reports and do traffic control. So often parking falls to the very bottom of that list, because if they have to go take an arrestee to book them into the jail, well, the parking issues are going to have to wait. What we found, though, is when it gets really busy like that, our priority shifts from routine parking enforcement for like expired registration or time violations. And instead we focus on those public safety issues. So that's blocking a fire hydrant, or, being parked in a crosswalk, or double parking, or we have very narrow alleyways. So if an alleyway is blocked so that a fire truck can't get through, we shift our focus away from kind of the turnover that we're looking for on Main Street to public safety and life safety issues instead of that. It means that some things don't get enforced as often as they probably should, but there's a lot of competing interests, and we try to prioritize life issues more than quality of life issues.
Well, Nick, thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us. You are deeply entrenched in parking, but we really value your perspective on it. I thank you for articulating so well that parking is really about quality of life, and it is our job to be safe, to make it forgettable, and to value each other as we help each other along in this industry.
Well, thank you so much for having me. If I could just leave with with one comment is, this cannot be the end of the conversation. And even when we talk about those little things like the box breathing or how to fill out, a couple boxes on the handheld and look around, these are perishable skills, number one, which means if you don't use them, if you don't practice them, you're going to forget them. It's not like riding a bike. You have to actively do this. The second thing is as an industry, we have to have more conversations around this. And, again, I'm not passionate about this, but I feel this deep obligation now that I realize that there's this problem to help fix it. So please let me be a resource to you. If you want to talk about, implementing a body cam program or, how to encourage your people to take more ownership of their roles or empowerment, let me help you and let me, be the guy who can kind of guide you through things. I don't have all the answers by any means, but I don't think there's anybody saying it quite like I am, especially not a police captain, right? That's saying these things. So please, whether it's with me or with your colleagues or anyone else in this wonderful industry that we're a part of, please don't let these conversations stop happening. We need to do this a lot more. So thank you so much to this group. Thank you for having me on the show so that we can continue these conversations.
Yes, you are welcome. Well, to our listeners, I hope wherever you are today, whether you're in traffic or sitting in your office or washing the dishes, thanks for joining us. Thanks for your time. We hope you found the knowledge and resources that you were looking for. And as Nick said, we need to stop spiraling about the problem and refocus on what is the solution. So we hope that you found something to move towards in this episode, and you'll join us next time on the Our Parking Industry podcast. Goodbye, everybody.
To quote one of the greatest business minds of our time, Charles Munger, he said, "The best thing a human can do is help another human being know more." Here on Our Parking Industry podcast, we want to provide knowledge and resources. If you heard something that sparked your curiosity in today's episode, please reach out on our socials at TPN Consulting. You can find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Don't forget to subscribe and follow. See you next time on Our Parking Industry.